Hi, in last week's video we looked at the purpose-driven life and discovering our purpose and our calling in relation to God. And we read from Romans 8:28 and verse 29 how God had predestined those whom He foreknew, and that He had predestined them to what? To become conformed to the image of His beloved Son. And ultimately that is our ultimate purpose in life. Our purpose in life, as we talked about, was not to do. Rather, our purpose was ultimately to become conformed to the image of the Son of God. And that's God's chief purpose in our life, to look more and more like Jesus Christ, that we would become conformed to His very image. And as I thought about last week's lesson and the ramifications of that, I thought, well, how does one release God's purpose ultimately in our life? How do I get to that point in my life to where I have resigned myself to God's purposes and following His will for my life? And ultimately I was brought by the Lord, I believe, to Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, where Paul says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." If you ultimately want to release the good and acceptable, perfect will of God in your life, to become the thing that God has called you to become, and to do the thing that God has ultimately called you to do, that cannot begin until there is a resignation of self, until there is a submission to Him, until one turns your life over to His. He who would keep his life, Jesus said, would lose it. But he who would lose his life for my sake and the sake of the gospel, Jesus said, would find it. If you truly want to find what your purpose in life is, if you want to truly experience life to the fullness and have God's will accomplished in your life, you must first, Paul says, offer your bodies over to Him as a holy and living sacrifice. And unless you do that, then verse 2 cannot happen, that you can prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. We need to heed Paul's exhortation. We need to, instead of conforming our lives to whatever wishes and desires we have for our life, instead of conforming our lives to the wishes and desires of well-meaning, loving, and caring people that may be in our lives, parents, grandparents, friends, family, co-workers, people at church, pastors, ministers, and any other sort of influence, we have to ultimately subject ourselves to the influence of Jesus Christ in our lives. We need to put ourselves under submission to Him and His lordship. The will of God cannot be accomplished in your life apart from that submission to Jesus Christ as Lord. He is King of kings, and He is Lord of lords. Therefore, we are not our own. We are not free to think our own thoughts. We are not free to do our own thing. We are not free to seek our own glory, but we are ultimately freed to seek His glory, to seek His will, and to accomplish His desire. But that cannot happen unless our heart is fully surrendered to Him. Unless our heart is fully surrendered to Him. Often in my life, I have examined my life and sometimes found that my heart was not always subject to the will of God. Instead, I desired to do what my parents, believe it or not, Mom and Dad, sometimes I have desired to do what you would have me to do with my life. The same goes with relationships, the same with romantic relationships, the same goes with relationships with other individuals within the church, to people I work with, those very sort of things. But ultimately, it's not about them. Rather, it's about Him. Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, and it will only be through His mercy that you can do this, because it will not be something you can do in your own strength. Even you would not even will it of yourself to do this. It can only be accomplished by the mercy of God, that we present ourselves a living and holy sacrifice. Our lives are not our own. Our will is not to be our own. And if we want to truly accomplish God's plan and purpose in our lives, we have to ultimately recognize that He's the one in charge, and that He is the one that rules. I had this wonderful devotional thought that I read once in Oswald Chambers' devotional book that everybody knows very well, My Utmost for His Highest. And on his September 4th devotion, he starts off his devotion, and it's just simply titled, His. And I'd just like to read the opening line of His for the devotion that happened on September 4th by Oswald Chambers. And Chambers wrote, "The missionary is one in whom the Holy Ghost has wrought this realization: ye are not your own." Have you realized that in your own life? You see, somebody who feels called to be a missionary, somebody who feels called to do an apostolic work, ultimately is somebody who has resigned themselves to doing whatever it is the will of the Lord is. They are an individual who has hopefully decided that the Lord is worth following. And as a result, they'll go wherever God sends them to go, and they'll say whatever it is God has them to say. They don't go to distant lands because they simply chose to. They don't go speak a gospel to people who don't want to hear it simply because they chose to. Whether they are individuals who have submitted themselves to the Lordship of Jesus Christ and realized they are not their own. That is why they go to the far reaches of the earth. That is why they waste themselves for Jesus Christ. That's why the Apostle Paul could be the Apostle Paul. That's why Peter could be the Apostle Peter. That's why these individuals could be the individuals who they were. Because they ultimately had a relationship with the Lord that caused them to realize, I am not my own. I belong wholly to another. Have you realized that in your life? That you belong wholly to another?